Now by apologizing because people will think I'm mad wearing glasses.
Yeah, you make some opening remarks.
No, I'm not mad.
Yeah, just feel comfortable.
Just to apologize for having to wear sunglasses indoors because I've just had an operation on my eye and the light is currently a bit difficult to cope with.
Yeah, but are they okay?
Yes. It's only for correcting vision, so it's not. It takes time to heal.
Thank you, Professor Mona Baker, for making the time to take the interview, given your busy schedule.
Thank you.
Would you like to say hi to your audience, please?
Okay, so none of what I said before was recorded, right?
It is being recorded now.
Well, hello to everybody who's watching. I'm very pleased to be giving this interview and to know that it will be shown in China to many students and would-be students. And I'll say again, because I think it wasn't recorded when I said it, that I apologize for having to wear sunglasses indoors for this interview and not to have immediate eye contact. But I've had an operation on my eyes recently, and the light is currently bothering me a bit. So my apologies.
Well, don't worry, you look perfect.
Thank you.
So, Mona Baker is a household name for translation scholars worldwide. Your research always represents the current trend of translation studies in the international academic circle. So, what's your success story? How do you keep a good balance between teaching and research?
It is very difficult for all academics to keep a good balance between teaching and research, and provided you are in the right kind of environment and your colleagues and your university and school are supportive, the only way you really can do it is by bringing the two together so that you're allowed to teach areas that interest you and that feed into your research. I think it becomes extremely difficult when you have to teach something that you are not interested in at all and that does not contribute to your research in any way. Good teaching obviously draws on good research, so everybody wins if the university, the colleagues you work with ensure that everybody's teaching and the research are in harmony.
So no matter what you do, the most important thing is that you need to fall in love with what you do.
Absolutely. I think that applies to everything in life, don't you?
So you apply what you research into what you teach.
That's right.
And this is good balance.
And you research what you really enjoy researching, not because it's a fashion or not because somebody else is doing it, but because you really feel that it's an important area of research to pursue.
Yeah, thank you, Mona. Now, without further ado, I'd like to consult you on a few questions, which are either related to translation studies or you as a world-renowned scholar of translation studies. We know that translation studies is an academic interdiscipline, dealing with the systematic study of the theory, description, and application of translation, interpreting, and localization. So first, may we have your perspective on the true essence and or nature of translation studies?
Okay, I normally don't like to speak of essences and nature because my own intellectual background and beliefs are such that I don't subscribe to the view that anything has an essence, because an essence is fixed, it's rigid, it's not negotiable. Whereas I believe everything in life is negotiable and should be negotiable. So,
sorry to interrupt. Do you agree or reject the so-called terms, like cultural terms, different kind of turn?
No, I don't accept the notion of turns either, because it suggests that translation studies is much more restricted than it really is. Turns means that you only have one fashion at a time, and that once you have a new turn, everything else gets thrown out, which really doesn't reflect what is going on in the discipline. But going back to translation studies, I think the way you framed your question is absolutely right. Translation study is an interdiscipline, and it's extremely multidisciplinary. In terms of the approaches it attracts and the kinds of things it can engage with. Also in terms of the way in which This is increasingly becoming evident, certainly in the UK and the US, for example, in the way in which it engages other disciplines. So if you look at almost any discipline now, if you look at sociology, of course, literature, we're used to that, media studies, almost every discipline now has something to say about translation. Not always in the way we would like them to say it, but they are real. Anthropology, philosophy,
history.
All disciplines cannot ignore the issue of translation, and increasingly they're becoming aware of this fact, and they're beginning to reflect on it much more critically than they used to before. I always used to say that a lot of the most inspiring theorists are extremely critical, extremely inspiring in their own work, but when they come to talk about translation, they're very disappointing. It's a kind of blind spot for many people. But this is changing, and it's very, very good for translation studies, because we are now having the benefit of people who are very sophisticated and know a lot about their own areas, whether it's anthropology or philosophy or sociology or media studies. We have the benefit of them now also reflecting on translation and showing us aspects of translation that perhaps we were not quite aware of. So I think that the strength of translation studies as a discipline is precisely its interdisciplinarity, its ability to engage other disciplines in this very, very productive way.
So although it's a new discipline, it keeps drawing new blood from different subjects.
Absolutely. I don't know how the situation is developing in that respect in China, but certainly in the UK, for example, we're trying to persuade people that translation studies is important, that there has to be a discipline, people have to engage with it. And now we've got to the stage where the biggest funding body in the humanities, which is the Arts and Humanities Research Council, actually has explicitly launched grant streams that are called things like translating cultures. And we used to complain that we couldn't get any grants because people didn't take translation seriously. Now it's actually translation.
Hard work.
Everybody wants to work with translation because it's a way of getting grants as well.
Right.
So it's become very much on the table, on the agenda as a very important area of study.
Yeah, with scholars like Professor Mona Baker and other world-renowned scholars of translation studies, I think the discipline of translation studies will be more promising in the future.
I hope so.
Thank you very much for the contributions you have made to this discipline.
Thank you. I'm not on my own. There are lots of people who are contributing also from outside translation studies, as I said. Right.
Now, my second question is, what's trending now? That is to say, could you shed some light on the latest trends in translation studies within the academic circle?
Yes, right. I like the fact that you say trends, not trend, because that would reflect the situation much better, and it moves us away from the idea of terms and so on. There are actually quite a number of very important trends now in translation studies that are gaining a huge momentum. Some of them I have a lot of affinity with and reflect areas that I want to work in. Some I don't have any affinity with, but I recognize that it is a trend that has captured a lot of attention. So, for example, one of the big areas of interest now is the cognitive aspect of translation and interpreting.
Attached to linguistics?
Not just linguistics, psychology, psycholinguistics. This is a very, very big and growing trend. It's one that I don't personally engage with, but I recognize. For example, it was very, very evident in the latest conference of the International Association for Translation and Intercultural Studies, which took place in Brazil in July. And a lot of people were talking about cognitive aspects, but also the interface with technology, which has a very strong cognitive side, not just a cognitive side. So that's an area that is very much on the rise. Corpus-based studies is still very much of interest to a lot of people, and I hope that it's about to get another big push forward because
you are the one that introduced the theory into this field.
But because I and several colleagues here in Manchester have just won a very big grant for 4 years to do corpus-based work from a very new angle. So looking at the way in which key concepts like democracy and equality and the concepts that underpin our scientific thinking like proof, experiment and so on, how these concepts have over the years, over many centuries, starting with the Greeks, have traveled through translation and been changed, renegotiated, transformed. And in order to study this, we are going to build very big corpora of Greek, Latin, Arabic, and English as the big lingua francas of the world.
Compared with the first corpus system you built a long time ago,
that's
this
right.
one is much more.
It's much more complex, and it's not looking at the way in which translation differs from non-translation. It's looking at the way translation is embedded in all the processes of negotiation of meaning across the ages, which I think is one of the valid criticisms of corpus-based work over the years, has been that it's quite narrow, that it doesn't look at issues of conceptual and ideological transformations. So we're now addressing this, and I think that's going to give corpus-based studies a new lease of life. There's also another area I'm very interested in, which is on the rise and is growing, which is the interface between translation and citizen media. By citizen media, I don't mean just citizen journalism. I mean any kind of negotiation and use of any form of media by ordinary unaffiliated citizens to intervene in public space. So it includes even things like street theatre, all the stuff that goes on the web, of course, tweeting, and that's right. So
Localization.
Localization, not through the official means. The whole idea is this is what's happening at the level of ordinary citizens, not at the level of companies or of governments.
Website.
Well, it depends on who's setting up the websites, whether it's ordinary citizens.
It's official or ordinary citizens.
That's right. So that's another big area, and of course politics and conflict, which is an area I know that your institution is very interested in. That's a very continues to be a very important area.
So that will be the future trend still.
Yes, definitely. I think these things are going on for many more years to come. That's right.
Thank you very much. Professor Monobeko, you once rejected the idea that translation plays the role of bridge. It goes beyond that. In that case, what role does translation play in the process of developing current international relations and establishing the international image of different countries and nations?
Right. I rejected the idea of translation. It's a metaphor, really, being a bridge, because it's a metaphor that intensifies our blind spots. It tries to tell us that translation is always benign, it's always positive, it always plays a very positive role. But like everything else in life, translation plays positive as well as negative roles. It doesn't play a single role, it plays a whole range of roles. Some of them are very positive in terms of bringing about comfort, peace, solidarity, and some of them are very negative. For example, I have an article in Critical Studies on Terrorism which addresses this issue in particular. Translation is one of the big ways in which certain politically motivated groups try to demonize whole populations like the Muslims or Iranians or Arabs, and they do it through translation. So it plays both roles, and the idea, and I suppose you could think of a bridge in the same way. So, as I said, I think on my old website that bridges allow people to communicate, to come together, to understand each other
Facilitate
better.
the communication.
But they also allow invading armies to come across and do a lot of damage.
Put it this way, translation does play the role of bridge, but it goes beyond that. And it also leads to the issue of ethics that you have been keeping talking about. Could you elaborate on what you mean by ethics and how is it applied to translation studies?
This is actually one of the big areas of interest that is drawing more people into the discipline as well. Issue of the ethical implications of the work that translators and interpreters do, whether they are professional, meaning they are being paid for what they do, or whether they volunteer. And by this I mean that every action has implications,
yes.
and translation and interpreting, therefore, must have implications for the people involved, not just the people involved in the immediate situation in which the interpreting takes place, but for people who are not even involved in that situation. So, for example, the way you translate a literary text, which says certain things or projects a particular image of a particular community in the world, even though that community is not immediately involved in that process of translation, the way you translate that has implications for that community, the way other people think about them, for example. So we have to be very conscious of that, both in terms of whether or not we accept certain translation works, and there is a lot, I've written on that a lot of professional translators who earn their living through translation and who really rely on translation for a living, even they sometimes come to a point where they say, no, I will not translate this text, even if I lose income, because it is unethical, because it will do harm to others. And that's what ethics is about, is whether you do harm to others or not. So it's a question of partly of whether you accept certain commissions, whether you accept being part of particular projects as a translator, and then once you've taken on a project, how you approach the translation. Sometimes people, for example, will take on a piece of work, for example, translate a text that is very damaging to certain communities, like the Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. They will agree to translate it. They may even take the initiative themselves to go to a publisher and say this needs translating. But they don't translate it uncritically. They don't translate it without mounting a critique and a challenge in the preface, in the introduction, in footnotes that question what the author is saying. So all this is part of how the translator and the interpreter should conduct themselves in a way that does not do harm to others, because I think that's very important. In many, I mean, it's important in everything you do in life, but there are certain professions like translation, like medicine, that have an extra responsibility, if you like, to think very critically about the ethical implications of what they do.
So you need to be a responsible translator. What you do, what you translate, will have a bearing on the life and death of other people.
Who are totally dependent on it, because they know the languages that are being used, who have only you as an authority to mediate the world for them. So it's an additional responsibility.
Well, thank you so much for offering your insightful elaboration on that point. Well, what are the critical factors influencing the translation of political discourse and its international acceptance?
Political discourse in general, you mean, not just in translation? Oh, there are a lot of factors, of course. It's a very, very complex question. There is institutional power. Who has the power to actually make that discourse available to larger numbers of people in the first place?
Does it relate to ideology?
Of course. Everything relates to ideology. So there's institutional power. There is the quality of the discourse itself, whether it's able to resonate with people once it reaches them. The number of people who are willing to keep pushing a particular discourse forward, sometimes even against the odds, against institutional power. So there's a lot of different factors, and of course translation plays a big role in this. So quality of the original discourse, the way the translation mediates that discourse in another culture in such a way that it's understood and it does not challenge it should challenge, sometimes it should challenge the values, but it does not offend, for example, unduly, unnecessarily, and it's effective in the way that the original authors wanted to be effective, for example. All these are issues. It's a very complex question, really.
So when you do this translation, what kind of method would you prefer to apply, either domestication or foreignization, or will you consider a scopus theory, the purpose that's involved?
As you probably know, I have critiqued the distinction between domestication and foreignization already in, among other things, an article I published in Social Semiotics in 2007, because it oversimplifies the situation. So I don't actually believe in methods that you can apply uncritically in any context. I think even within the same text, even within the same translation, you vary your methods depending on what is being translated and who you're trying to reach. Domestication and foreignization are too abstract for me, and there's also the idea that domestication is bad and foreignization is good. And it's like
can't just go to extremes about that.
And scopus theory, I don't believe in, because I find it far too oriented towards the professional market in a way that really obscures the ethical implications of translation. So it encourages you to do whatever the commissioner wants you to do. And so a good translator fulfills the scopus that is given to them by a commissioner, and so it turns the translator into a passive, apolitical animal who just does what they do without thinking about the ethical implications, and that is very dangerous, I think.
Yeah, thank you. This question actually concerns a lot of translation scholars specialized in applying narrative theory to doing the related research. But what is the status quo of narrative theory? To my knowledge, it seems that in China, narrative theory has not yet reached a high level of development. Why should that be?
Probably partly because there haven't been yet enough publications on it. So theories capture more attention as more people engage with them. This is actually happening now. There's a lot more literature coming out, but it's a recent thing. It takes time for people to engage with a new theory in a discipline. So it's partly that. And most of the literature that is available in English only. As far as I know, it's only my book, Translation and Conflict, that has been translated into Chinese.
By your former PhD
student? By Wenjing, German Wenjing. Which means that it's only people who can read English who can really engage with the larger literature. That's part of the problem. Another problem is that narrative theory is not easy to apply. It does not give you these dualisms like foreignization and domestication and say, what is this? Is this domesticating? Is this foreignizing? If it's domesticating, it's bad. If it's foreignizing, it's good. It doesn't give you these templates to work with. It really forces you to bring yourself into the situation of the text that is being translated. And forces you also to take a position, because you cannot, it says that the narrator, including the translator, cannot stand outside the narrative, and therefore it requires you to be far more innovative in the way you engage with material in order to make sense of it as a narrative. And it also it forces you to make clear where you stand on the issues. And a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people would rather see their job as analyzing objectively material that they're not engaged in. So it's not to everybody's taste in that sense.
Yeah. Well, actually, Miles Wang, someone you know very much, has published an article giving some critical remarks on the Chinese version done by Wenjing.
I'd love to be able to read this, but of course it's in Chinese.
When you visit us at the end of November, Miles Wang, can translate that into English personally to you.
I'd love to hear that.
So we know that you're one of the leading initiators for the workshop on translation studies, targeting narrative theory, to be held next March in Shanghai Jiao Tong University. Could you tell us how many people have registered at the present time, and which studies will be most worthy of our attention?
I have no idea actually, because I'm not involved in the organization at that level. I'm going to speak, but I was involved in helping with putting the proposal together for artists, which is the group that authorizes running of these, approves the running of these workshops. So I was involved in providing some help with putting the proposal together, but I'm not actually following up. I have no idea. But I hope it will attract a lot of people. There will be some very, very good speakers there.
Right.
From outside translation studies as well, which is very interesting because you then get that different perspective and new viewpoints on narrative that we haven't developed yet. And Sue Ann Harding, who is one of the best people working in this area, will also be there.
Right. Will you give some keynote speech?
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. I'm also giving, but that's not on narrative theory specifically. I'm also giving a lecture at Hong Kong Baptist University in April. Another artist event.
Yes. Your friends and students were very much keen on knowing how translation studies has made a difference in your personal life.
I have a very unusual academic career. Most academics finish their undergraduate studies, master's studies, then do a PhD, then go straight into academia. I didn't do that at all. I finished my undergraduate studies in Egypt, and then my husband was English. When we married, we came
American
here,
University
in Cairo, yeah. And that was in literature.
Right.
And then after, and then I always translated professionally.
You went to Birmingham.
Went to Birmingham. Eventually, I did a lot of translation work first, and then continued doing translation work when I did my MA in Birmingham. My mentor at the time, the late John Sinclair, who has exercised huge influence on my thinking and my career, really wanted me to do a PhD, and I did my best, but I didn't like the idea at all. I didn't like the idea of writing something that only a few people would read, so I told him no, I won't do it, and I wrote In Other Words instead.
That's a very popular book.
Yes, I'm working on the 3rd edition.
Wow.
And so I decided to not pursue that because I wasn't really interested in an academic career anyway. And so I wrote In Other Words, and then did the Routledge Encyclopedia. I took some few bits of teaching, but I did a lot of translation all the time. And then eventually, when I started getting into academia, fairly late in life, they asked me to put in an application for what is called a higher doctorate here, which is a doctorate that you get on the basis of your whole profile of publications and research throughout rather than just one piece. And I got that, and so I didn't really follow that route at all. And so translation as such and translation studies as a discipline have both been very important in my life and my career. Actual translation, of course, taught me a lot. I mean, you learn so much when you translate. You learn about things that you never thought you would learn anything about.
Keep drawing fresh things from different
exactly,
subjects.
and also you meet different people from different areas. So it really enriches your life. I remember colleagues in Birmingham making fun of me when I told them translation studies is one day going to be as big as teaching English as a foreign language, and they thought I was dreaming. So it was very, very exciting watching it develop very gradually over many years and capture so much international attention. It gives you a real kind of confidence in what you're researching after a while. But also you learn a lot from it because it's so interdisciplinary, because you have to read in sociology, you have to read in philosophy, you have to read in literature. Unlike other areas where you're really confined in what you specialize in.
Right.
So it's been tremendous. It's formed me as a person. What I know about the world, what I think about the world is very much influenced by both the practice of translation and the academic study of translation.
You keep broadening your horizons.
Yes, I don't like doing the same thing all the time. I get bored.
Kind of acting on a whim. Toddler, teenager, grown up. which stage of development is translation studies currently placed?
I would say it is currently in its most exciting state of development. It's, I always
Has it
think,
reached the climax?
no, not yet. That's why it's exciting. I always think, when I look back on my own life, I think always that your 30s are the most exciting time and the most productive time of your life. I would say translation studies, it's in its 30s now.
So much more to look forward to.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, finally, Professor Mona Baker, could you give some good wishes and congratulatory remarks to our MOOC translation course, to the MOOC itself, to organizers, teachers, and students?
Absolutely. Best of luck with this. I think MOOC courses are very, very helpful to a lot of people who can't otherwise access different types of education. So I'm all for it, and I congratulate those who find the time and energy and institutional support to be able to do it, because of course you can't do it without institutional support. So I think we need to congratulate the institution as well for providing that space and allowing them the time to develop this course.
So thank you very much for sharing your inspiring ideas with us today, which has afforded us plenty of food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everything. Thank you for the present and everything. Thank you.